Hey, it's me, Ben Avery, and this is Strangers and Aliens, which is a YouTube channel and a podcast feed about the intersection, the nexus point, if you would, between faith and fantasy, between spirituality and science fiction, between Christianity and creativity. And this is a little bit of a different episode, although it still does get into the geeky stuff and it still does get into the spiritual stuff. But this is a presentation that I did as a breakout session at a children's ministry conference a little bit ago. And what I did was I just kind of took just different storytelling principles, I guess. That's what I call them in the video. Storytelling principles that I've picked up along my years of working as a writer for comic books and everything like that, but then also working as a children's pastor and as a children's ministry volunteer. And so kind of put them all together into one package. I didn't get to finish everything. It was only a 45-minute session, and there were a couple points at the end that I wasn't able to get into. And so as I was getting ready to put this video out, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. I can go ahead and put those extra little 2 points that I wanted to cover in at the end of this video. Now, this is specifically about telling stories from the Bible, and it's some of the principles that I picked up when I was writing The Christ and writing some other Bible-based story comics, and then also things that I work through philosophically when I'm thinking through what do I want to do when I'm telling a story to children, especially, but even to adults and teenagers when I'm preaching. But what are some things that I want to make sure that I do when I am presenting a Bible story? And so these are also principles that come in handy maybe when you're talking about a true story, when you're writing a nonfiction thing, or when you are even telling your own testimony. Some of these things apply to that. So there's just kind of a broad application to these storytelling principles. I'm going to present this video, but I do want to mention that the room was packed. It was a very small room. They said there were 68 people in the room. I don't know. I didn't count myself. But some people from my ministry team who were there couldn't get in because the room, they closed the door and they were turning people away at the door. That included my wife. So it was packed in tight, and I had set up my iPad to record this, and I had to keep bringing it in closer and kind of turning at a weird angle. So this recording is at a weird angle. And if you're joining me because you were at the conference and you asked for my PDF of my notes, welcome. Hope you like the channel. Please hit like, hit subscribe, and maybe you can check out some of my other videos and interact with me here on the channel. So without any further ado, here it is. Biblical storytelling lessons from Stan Lee, Star Wars, the Muppets, and more. And the bonus 2 things at the end. One of them is part of that and more. All right, so my name is Ben Avery, and I'm just going to go ahead and assume that most of you do not know who I am, although it is possible you may have seen some of my work around over time, over the years. My most recent work that I've done, other than my full-time day job, which is children's pastor at Napanee Missionary Church in Napanee, Indiana, my most recent work has been working with Kingstone Comics. Kingstone Comics does something called the Kingstone Bible. They did a book called the Book of God. They did a book called The Christ. I'm going to show you a couple of my things. This is not to get you to buy my book, but if you want to, you can. But this is also to give you a little bit of context as we jump into some of the things I do, and to give you some of the background so that when I do throw something out, you probably will be able to understand what I'm talking about when I throw it out. Kingstone did a book called the Kingstone Bible that's been split up into these graphic novels there's I think 6 of them in paperback, 3 of them in hardcover. If you buy the hardcover ones from their website, it is basically 3 bricks. I mean, it is literally a cinder block of comics. And it does go from Genesis to Revelation. I did not write the whole thing, but one of the things that I did write was The Christ for them, which is a 12-issue series that got collected in there. And this is a harmony of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in comic book form. I also wrote the Book of God for them, which tells the story of how the Bible came to be, tells the story of how the Bible was preserved, how it was translated, how it was inspired, all those things. Their mission is to get the comics out there with the Bible, and now with some historical stories that they're doing as well. And the idea is to put the Bible in a format that reluctant readers are going to be willing to pick up.
middle schoolers, elementary school kids, even high schoolers who are reluctant to read, and also then people who like to read comic books. And so that's what my most recent work was. I started out writing comics just on my own, just for fun. Went to film school to learn about just how to write visually for film. I thought my wife and I were going to move to Los Angeles, where that was going to be my mission field. We ended up not moving to Los Angeles. It's a long story, but that was the long and the short of it was we made some sacrifices to go to Los Angeles, and then I came back home to Indiana, and we both decided that was not what God's calling us to, but we didn't understand what was going on. What ended up happening then was I started getting involved in, this is going to age me a little bit, although this whole speech is going to age me a little bit. And I got involved in some Yahoo email groups for Christian comic creators, and so I met an artist. He got me a job writing a book for George R.R. Martin, who is a Game of Thrones guy. George R.R. And so he selected my sample, and I got that job. That was my first professional job writing comic books. Came directly from learning how to write for film. And so that started my career writing comic books, which for some period of time, it was my only thing I was doing. I've written animation, I've written stage plays, and I call myself Ben Avery, storyteller on my Facebook and my Instagram, not because I'm like a library storyteller that you can hire to come in and tell stories, but because that's what I do. I'm not just a comic book writer or whatever. I've just written my first science fiction novel, just for myself, and I was just like, I want to do this, I'm going to have fun with it. And then the other thing that I do that will give you a little bit of context into just who I am and what I do a podcast called Strangers and Aliens. It's about Christianity and science fiction and fantasy and pop culture and all that stuff. And so a lot of what I'm talking about here comes from a lot of those conversations we've had. I've never done this before, where I've kind of put all these things into one. So I'm really I told my wife I was really nervous about this. Last night I just hit a point where I'm like, nope, I just have to go to bed and not worry about this anymore. But what I want to talk about today, these are things that are going to be, one more thing I need to show you that I did. Just again, to give you some context. This is a book called Paul the Apostle, and this is a book called Peter the Apostle. And in a moment, we're going to talk about the dichotomy between this, and how I may even be breaking one of my own rules here. I don't think I am, but I'll give you my reasoning for why I did this, and I'll also give you my least favorite VeggieTales episode. And I'll also tell you, and I'm not going to name names, but I will also tell you the most embarrassing story of my professional life ever, and it has to do with that particular episode of VeggieTales. So what I'm going to talk about, these are going to be kind of just some practices that you can do as you're getting ready to tell stories. And as you're getting ready, especially to dig into the Bible and tell stories from the Bible, these things can also apply to really any writing of any kind. Can apply to if you are like creating a character and doing like a puppet character who appears every week, and even telling your own testimony. These are all different things that they're pretty broad as far as what they are. But then as I was thinking about what would I pitch to Kids Matter to talk about, I just started thinking about some of these different things, these concepts and these principles that I've talked about on my podcast, that I've talked about when I taught high school English, that I talked about when I'm just talking about storytelling with like our summer interns do a speaking workshop, and I've done a couple times where I've spoken for them. And so it's just kind of these best practices that I'm pulling together from my experience loving Star Wars since I was 3 years old in theaters, 1977. I was there, not opening night, maybe not even opening month, because I lived in Canada at the time and the movies came there later. But I was there, and it was between Superman, Super Friends, Star Wars in the theaters, seeing all these things, and then comic books that I would read, and these were all just things that just fueled my imagination. And so this is kind of taking like that childhood experience, and then taking that college experience where I'm actually like studying this stuff, and then taking that film school experience, and then taking just the experience of talking to kids and telling stories, kind of put them all together. So the first principle I want to talk about here is this. It's the with great power comes great responsibility principle. Now, the with great power comes great responsibility principle, or the WCP CGR principle, comes from Stan Lee, Amazing Tales #1, where Peter Parker, it's narration. It is not Uncle Ben who says this originally. It's in the narration, but he's just learned with great power comes great responsibility. But specifically, the power is story. Story is one of the most powerful things that we as humans have. And we're going to get into some of the biblical proof behind this, but it is one of the most powerful things that we as human beings have. There is power in story, there's power in parable, there's power in metaphor, there's power in creativity. Story creates interest, intimacy, understanding, and connection. These are all 4 things that just kind of get into what is the power of story. And why don't you think about what happens when you come home from work after a long day. You tell your kids, you tell your wife a story about what happened while you were at work. It's just what happens. What about jokes? I mean, jokes create connection because you laugh together when you tell the joke. Or when you're sitting with your friends around the table, what are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about last month the craziest thing happened to me. I haven't seen you since this happened. Let me tell you about it. And so you tell these stories. And what these stories do, whether they are true stories that have happened to you, or whether they are a joke that someone has told you and you laughed at it, and you want to tell other people and have them laugh, or whether it's just talking about a movie that you saw and doing the water cooler conversation after The Office or whatever, that was the big one. But story creates these connections, a connection of intimacy where you're telling, like, this is my life, connection of understandings to let people know who you are and who I am. One of the things that I've heard people say before, and I totally get it now because I do this, is when you have someone, they're telling a story and then you want to jump in with your story that's similar, but maybe a little bit bigger or a little bit worse. You want people to understand, I'm with you. I'm tracking with you right now, and I have an experience that is with you. Objects, parables, metaphors, and stories help explain and explore new ideas, difficult concepts, experiences, and truth. So these are things a story present then. New ideas, difficult concepts, that's, again, the parables and metaphors that Jesus used. You explain your experiences so people can know who you are. That's why when I opened up, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background to who I am and what I've done and what brings me here today to talk about this stuff. But then also, this is the important thing here, it explores truth. And this is because you're telling a true story. If you're telling a joke, that explores truth because you hit that punchline and you're expecting one thing, and then you get hit with another thing, and you laugh because it's not what you expected. But it explores truth because you are kind of sitting in, well, what should have happened, And then you find out that, and then he slipped on the banana peel or whatever. But there's some of the roundabout ways of getting to truth. C.S. Lewis talks about how, especially Norse mythology led C.S. Lewis to follow Jesus because of the truths that he engaged with when he would hear these stories, and then the truths that he was hearing as his friends were talking about Christ and talking about Christianity. So in practice, with great power comes great responsibility principle. Story is powerful, use it, okay? And that's pretty simple that I put it up there, but there's going to be lots of things up here that are just going to be very, very sensible things. But it's good to be reminded about sensible things. All right, so next we have the parable principle. We're still not to Star Wars, we're not to Stan Lee, but we are to the great storyteller because he is the Word. Like literally, he is the Word. This is, I attribute this quote to the Bible, partially because there are 6 different verses that say something along the lines of he told them another parable. This is not just he told them a parable. If I was going with he told them a parable, I don't know how many times. There's like 28 different parables in the Gospels. It expands to 50 some if you include certain metaphors and things like that. He told them another parable. So that's times when he was actually like just telling them a series of stories, Jesus is teaching an example. There are more stories from Jesus than sermons in the Bible. And I believe that there is a reason for this. I believe that God inspired the gospel writers to include the stories and less of the sermons because that's what sticks. That's what makes connections, especially the people he was telling the stories to. He was telling them stories about things that they understood and things that they had experience with. And so I have a little just quick experiment we're going to do. Quick, tell your neighbor one of Jesus' parables. Just do it right now, quick. All right. And stop. Good. Okay. I only have 45 minutes here, so. All right, challenge number two. Challenge number two. Quick, tell your neighbor one of Jesus' sermon points. No, you can't use the title of the sermon. I need sermon points, okay? All right. So, now you guys did start doing that, and some of you might have started quoting the Beatitudes, which is another easy way of learning because it's a list, which is why, we have those things on the internet where it's 10, blah, 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 that God used it before the internet. 10 commandments, sermon on the, But there are more stories than sermons in the Bible. Why? Because stories are what stick. And stories make connection. And stories stick in your memory. Sermons, that's information, and it's good. It's good that we have those sermons from Jesus. And that's one of the reasons, honestly, why I believe the letters, while they're really powerful, we spend more time in the Gospels, especially with our kids, because it's so much easier to explain and explore the stories of Jesus. And I was teaching my kids, this is a free one, this is not in my notes. I was telling my kids about the armor of God. We're doing a series about the armor of God right now, which is another right here. And I might even do a giveaway with this one here. All right. I don't know how, but I've got a few of these. This is called Armor Quest. It's basically the armor of God plus the Lord of the Rings with a little bit of Star Wars thrown in, okay? So as I was teaching my kids about the armor of God, the thing is, I'm like, there's a story behind this. He was under house arrest. And when you're under house arrest, it means you can't leave the house, but you're free to go around. People can come in, they can leave, you can't. But he's being guarded by soldiers who are wearing the armor that he's talking about. And so I just found that so interesting, and so that's a story. Now, it's a list of things from Paul, but there's a little bit of story to give context about why he's talking about these things, because he's thinking about those guys are ready for action. That's the phrase I use, those guys are ready for action. What are some things that we need as Christians to be ready for action? And so you have that metaphor that he's using, and I'm not going to get into the armor of God. I've got to stick with my notes here. So maybe next year, okay? The parable, principle, and practice. God had the gospel writers preserve Jesus' story-based teachings for a reason. All right, so now we're getting into the title here a little bit. The Stan Lee principle. The Stan Lee principle. It's the importance of context. Stan Lee said, every comic book is someone's first. Every comic book is someone's first comic book, okay? Now, what does that mean? That means that back in the day when you couldn't just download from a website like every single issue of a comic book series or go and buy the graphic novel collection, a kid goes down to the 7-Eleven and whatever is there is what's available to the kid. For a long time, back in the 60s when he was doing this, there weren't even comic book shops because there just wasn't the collector's market yet, not like that. Now, there was certain places you could get back issues, but every comic book is someone's first. Stan Lee recognized that when a kid went into a 7-Eleven, it's quite possible that that kid has never been in that 7-Eleven before, but he's going to be attracted to the bright-colored superheroes. And so they're going to pick up Fantastic Four issue number 2, and they're not going to know what happened in Fantastic Four issue number 1. And so he wanted to make sure that anyone who picks up any comic book was able to get the context and understand what had gone before, especially then when you get into the 70s and you get into the 80s and you have, it's X-Men number 500, and you're picking up issue number 500. What are you looking at, And so you need to give them the context. So he had this principle that he advocated, and it was interesting. I was doing that George R.R. Martin project, and my editor said, "Did you name check this script for the second issue that I was turning in?" And I was like, "No, but I'll do it." So I went and did my spell check to make sure all the names were spelled correctly. And then I said, "Yep, they're all spelled correctly." He's like, "That's not what I'm talking about. What I mean by name check is that every character, when they appear on the page, we need to be able to see their name and know their name." And that comes from that Stan Lee principle of making sure that people understand when they come in that this is understandable. They have the context. Within the first couple of pages, you should know everything you need to know in order to enjoy the story, even if it was part 3 of a 4-part story. You had everything you needed to know. And and then back then, every month, they'd take comics off the shelf and they'd strip the covers and they'd throw them in the dumpster. And so there was just no way for the kids to be able to get those earlier stories, so they needed to understand. So what does this mean for us? We got some unfortunate information up here. 3 in 5 U.S. Protestant pastors say they consider someone who attends church more than once a month to be a regular churchgoer. More than once a month. Using this standard, 27% of Americans qualify as regular churchgoers. That's from a Lifeway research study last year. And so then you have the biblical literacy thing there from a Gallup poll. The number of people who read the Bible at least occasionally has dropped to 59% from 73% in the 1980s. Gallup said this in connection to that poll: we revere the Bible, we don't read it. We revere the Bible, we don't read it. 12% of Christians think Noah's wife was Joan of Arc. That, honestly, I'm pretty sure I read that joke in Reader's Digest on Laughter is the Best Medicine page, but this is from a 1997 Barna organization poll. This is a poll that they took. 80% of born-again Christians believe it is the Bible that says God helps them that help themselves. Again, that same poll. It was not the Bible. Ben Franklin said that. Which brings us back to the Stan Lee principle. Now more than ever, we need to make sure that we are following this principle. In practice, it means you need to treat every story as if it is someone in the room's first time to hear it. Now, that's not just a Bible story. That expands beyond that as well, to introducing songs, and with motions that, and I hate it, but what I try and do is I try and teach every time I do a song, even if the kids have already been there, I'll do, okay, here's the motions for the chorus. So you can do this, and honestly, if you can only do this, if you start here, end there, you're good to go, and then follow along and learn. But to try and give the kids some context of the song that they haven't been there every single week for 5 months to learn the motions. You've got to treat the kids that are coming in as if it's their first time. And sometimes it gets hard, sometimes it gets difficult, but you've just got to be careful to make sure that you are presenting the context so that they understand what's going on. Now, I have a little bit more practical stuff to go along with that, and that is the crawl principle. And I'm going to show you this, and everyone's going to maybe hear a chord in their head. This will, how geeky you are, the chord in your head that you hear when I show this. There it is. What do you hear, the chord? Yeah. You hear it. You hear it. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that's the Star Wars title card. And then after that Star Wars title card, you get the Star Wars crawl, right? The Star Wars crawl. You actually read, this is from Return of the Jedi. And this is everything you need to know. You didn't have to see the first 2 movies, which, yes, if you're going to start watching them, you start with Star Wars. No episode 4, all right? It's not A New Hope. It's just Star Wars. It was Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Then go back to the prequels if you want to. Now,
Disney doesn't exist.
but I'll argue with you on that one later. But it's the same thing with the Chronicles of Narnia. You start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then book 6, you read The Magician's Nephew, and you get all the backstory and everything. But anyway, let's get away from that. This is another freebie for you. This is the crawl from Return of the Jedi. It has everything you need to know. It has names. It has relationships. It has everything you need to know. It's in just a few minutes of music and words. Luke Skywalker has returned to his home planet of Tatooine in an attempt to rescue his friend Han Solo from the clutches of the vile gangster Jabba the Hutt. So you know the relationships here. Jabba the Hutt, bad guy. Han Solo, Luke, they're friends. Little does Luke know that the Galactic Empire, in all caps, very important, it's in all caps, has secretly begun construction on a new armored space station even more powerful than the first dread Death Star. When completed, the ultimate weapon will spell certain doom for the small band of rebels struggling to restore freedom to the galaxy. Everything you need to know to be able to jump into this story. And so you didn't have to see the other 2 movies, and you may not have when they first came out, because the VHS market was just beginning. But I remember sitting in the theater for Empire Strikes Back. I don't remember sitting in the theater for the first one. But when I was watching Empire Strikes Back, I remember sitting in the theater. I remember the air conditioning was on. I remember my dad with his arm around my shoulders. And as that crawl was going, because I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, and I was a reader, but it was going fast. And so he just starts whispering it to me. And he's just telling me. And I was ready then. I was ready. In fact, I remember thinking, rebels? Because it was talking about the rebels. Aren't rebels bad? Rebels are bad. But he read that to me, and I will never forget my dad with his arm around my shoulder, just helping me out to make sure that I knew what I was going to get into. That's who you need to be. You need to be that dad with the arm around the shoulder. Now, you're doing it from the stage probably, but you need to be able to give them context. Let them understand. Even if it's not like you're doing a 4-week series on the story of David. Maybe you're just doing one that jumps around from prophet to prophet. When you're talking about Jonah, you need to give context. You can't just assume that these kids know who Jonah is. So, it's important to contextualize. Review by setting the story. Review by setting up the characters and their connections to make sure and also clear up any confusion. I did a series once on just people who had multiple names in the Bible, or multiple names for different people in the Bible. So I did a series where we talked about Saul versus Saul. Who is who? Joseph and Joseph. Mary, 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 and the other Mary. And it was just a whole series just clearing up for the kids. There's lots of Josephs in the Bible. And there are still times when I'll say, okay, we're going to talk about Saul today. Does anyone know who Saul is? And a kid will raise his hand. And this is great. They've got that Bible knowledge, but he'll raise his hand. He was the king, right? No, this is a different one. Let's talk about a different one. That was before Jesus. This one's after Jesus. And so you want to give that kind of context. Reviewing, just be careful because it can get heavy. It can get boring. Now, Star Wars makes it exciting because of the bombastic music that's happening, and you're excited because you're about to get into something. So just another freebie right here. When I do review, often I will throw candy to the kids, okay? Now, here's the problem. When you do that, when you're throwing candy and because the kids are getting questions right, there's kids who don't know. There's the visiting kid. So here's what I do. This is a freebie. I throw 3 pieces of candy to the kid. So I would throw it to her, and I tell her to give a piece of candy to her neighbor and keep one for herself. And that way, it spreads it out a little bit, and kids who don't have a chance might be able to get one because of that. And then, or I'll say, make sure if you already have a piece of candy, so I may throw it to you next, you got to give away all 3, okay? Because we're spreading this out. We're spreading the love, all right? Okay, so that's my 3-piece rule. I also have rules about like if the candy hits you on the head and it's not for you, you get to keep it and that kind of thing. But the best one I had, I threw a sucker to a kid and it was going to a kid behind another kid. The other kid had his hand up because he wanted to answer a question. The stick went right through his fingers and just landed right there. It was so perfect. That kid got to keep that one and got an extra one. So, all right, the Victorian Gonzo principle. Victorian Gonzo principle. We're finally getting to the Muppets. Here's my quote. Welcome to the Christmas Carol. My name is Charles Dickens. And there he is. There he is. So let's talk about what might be quite possibly the greatest Christmas movie of all time. If not the greatest Christmas movie of all time, at least the greatest Muppet movie of all time. And again, I was in theaters for the other earlier ones. They are awesome, but I love this one so much. And it is absolutely, positively the best Christmas Carol adaptation of all time. Is it the best? Yes, it is, okay? Here's why it works so well. First of all, it sets the scene with historical accuracy. And it introduces the characters so well. You have Gonzo walking around, introducing the characters, talking about who Scrooge was. Now, he's quoting Charles Dickens. I mean, they're quoting the book in that movie, which, by the way, the book is one of my favorite novels of all time. That is it's an afternoon read. I used to read it every year at Christmas time. I spent a few years, like decades, that I didn't do it. And then last year, I finally went back and reread it again. It was one afternoon, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful little experience. By the way, Charles Dickens also wrote another book called The Life of Christ, which is about the life of Christ. And he wrote that for his kids for another Christmas. Wasn't intended to be published. It wasn't published until just a couple decades ago. But he actually follows a lot of what I'm talking about here when we're talking about the Bible. And it keeps the themes and the big ideas of the original. It's true to the original story with an energy and a personality from the storytellers. And you got Kermit as Bob Cratchit. That is inspired. It is inspired. Robin as Tiny Tim is the cutest thing ever. And it is heartbreaking when you find out he's going to die. He's going to die. And, it's heartbreaking in the other ones too. I went and saw, this again, going back to my childhood, I went and saw one of the old ones in the theater. It was weird. I went with the nurse from my dad's group home. I don't know why. I really don't. I keep thinking I need to ask my dad about the context there. But my dad ran group homes for adults with physical and mental handicaps, bringing them out of institutions, getting them into assisted living, and it was just this weird thing where the nurse took me to this movie. But anyway, you have the puppets, but you also have the human Scrooge, which again is perfection. Michael Caine is amazing. He can't sing worth anything, but he is amazing. And you also have the story itself. It's a perfect Christmas story that for us especially, it definitely brings in, there's that one line, and they kept it. They kept it in there, that line about Tiny Tim wanting people to see him and think about the man who made blind men see and lame men walk. And I'm getting chills thinking about it right now, okay? And that's still in this movie that was there for wide release. It's all there. This is the one that I go to every year, watch with my family. My family loves it. Other ones I'll watch every once in a while, but this one, every year I'm watching it with my family. Another thing is, it's not insulting. It's not insulting. It could have been. It could have just been so dumbed down, like the Mr. Magoo version, okay? It's not insulting. The liberties that it takes do not fundamentally change the meaning. So it takes liberties, it tells jokes along the way, but it does not fundamentally change the meaning. And it actually gives historical context. It is a period piece. It is a period piece that lets you see what the times were like. Yes, Bob Cratchit wouldn't have, if he was a real person, wouldn't have had all the rats working with him and then having the party after it was closing time or whatever. But you get the idea, and there's that metaphorical understanding of the times as well, where you see the frog, the pig, the rats, and they're all dealing, and the poor mouse family too, And you're seeing this metaphor that shows you about the times. And these are all things that when we're telling our Bible stories, we can draw on. We can tell jokes about the story. But we just have to make sure we don't change the fundamental ideas behind the story. And then we don't add things into it to give it our own meaning. That is one thing that really just bothers me, is when you have someone who is taking the story and twisting it because they have the meaning they want it to have. Which brings us to the VeggieTales episode. I was at a writing program in Los Angeles, and it was for writing screen. It was at the first Hollywood Presbyterian Church, and it was a wonderful experience, 5-week experience I went to. My wife and I made a lot of sacrifices to get me out there and to do it. I'm sitting at the table. We're talking about Christian media, and I'm like, you want to know my least favorite VeggieTales episode? It's King George and the Ducky. It's my least favorite one. And I start going off about, first of all, that was, I think, the first one, if not the first, one of the first ones, where things were just like floating, like they had arms, but they're invisible, And I was like, I went on about that. And then I was going on about how they changed the story fundamentally, changed the story to be about sharing. Because you have King George, or whoever Larry was, and he had his whole collection of rubber duckies, and there's Junior, who has just one rubber ducky, and he steals the one rubber ducky. And I remember the first time watching it, I realized, this is David and Bathsheba. Why are we doing David and Bathsheba for kids? Now, that said, I've taught that story to kindergarten and first grade. I have. It was in the curriculum. The teacher who was working on it, she's young. She's like, I don't want to do this. Can you do this? I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. I taught the story because it's about fidelity. It's about marriage. It's about, not murdering people too. But VeggieTales people fundamentally changed the meaning of the story to be about sharing, and then they have this whole thing. It was just, I still, like you can hear, like I'm still pretty passionate about it. I go off, and a hand goes up at the table, and he goes, I wrote that one. Yeah. And I was like, well, what I meant was, So the danger is the further you get when you dress a story up, which is the principle here. Dress the story up. Dress it up, but not too much, okay? You're the gonzo. That's you, okay? But dress it up. Go ahead and dress it up. Go ahead and talk about things from our culture, from our time. The kids are going to understand. When I'm talking about the armor of God, I'm talking about lightsabers. I'm talking about Captain America. I'm using these things that the kids understand, but it's things that don't change the meaning of a woman to a rubber ducky, okay? So, with that said, this is Paul and Peter. We didn't do a Mary one, so we don't do Peter, Paul, and Mary. But we've got Paul and Peter in space. And I always bristled against this because I've seen people do like David and Goliath, but Goliath is a giant robot, and David is, taking care of space sheep or whatever, because we're going to make it cool for the kids. We're going to make it cool for the kids. And I actually had people tell me, these are people in my circles, we're going to make it cool for the kids so the kids can see it. And what's great about this is you can show David cutting off the head of a robot. And and I'm just, no, the story's cool as it is. You can stop before he cuts off the head. It's cool as it is. So someone approached me about doing this, and I started thinking through I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to give it a shot. And so I did. Now, by the way, I only do the writing on these things. I do not do the artwork. And so when I brag about my books, it's because other people have drawn them and made them look beautiful, better than what was in my head. But with this, it was me saying, okay, so what would the purpose be of doing this? And again, it was to dress it up and dress up the metaphor. So in here, you have Paul is small and scrawny, and you have Barnabas who's big and huge and hulking. And that was to give you an idea of what those two guys really were like, because it says in Acts, they looked at Paul and Barnabas, and they thought Barnabas was Zeus. They thought Paul was Hermes, I think. And because Hermes is the messenger god, and Paul was the guy who was doing all the talking, And Barnabas was just big guy. So it's a visual metaphor. But if you did strip out all of the weird, dark crystal-looking characters and stuff like that, the script behind it is as biblical as I could get it. And so the scripting behind this versus this is pretty much the same. That was what I was going for anyway. Now, whether or not it worked, your mileage may vary, okay? I'm not going to go out on a limb and say, it's perfect, and if you disagree, I absolutely, you can disagree about, does this work or not? Do you like it or not? Is it offensive or not? Okay, I get it. I do. But that's what I was going for, was to try and put it in a visual language that would attract kids, but also would give them, again, historical context and understanding behind the stories. Next, we have the It's All Connected, hashtag It's All Connected principle. One of the other things I do is I do a podcast about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it started because of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. When Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the TV show, started out, which, by the way, season 1 to season 7, I think it was, amazing. It is an amazing story arc for a character, and the character of Coulson is one of the most Christian characters you can have without him being a Christian, but we're not going to get into that right now. This was the promotional hashtag for when Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. came out, because they wanted you to understand and recognize that it was part of the Marvel movie universe. It's all connected. The It's All Connected principle and practice is don't forget the focal point, and don't forget the connections, the connecting point. This is a series I do not every Christmas, but about every other Christmas, from tree to tree. And it goes from the tree in the Old Testament that brought sin to the tree in Revelation, which is part of our time in heaven, and then the trees in between there. Now, obviously, I do tell the kids the Christmas tree is not in the Bible, but it's a symbol for Christmas time when Jesus was born. And I give the context. Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, but that we had to have some time. If we're going to celebrate a birthday, you have to have a day. But from tree to tree. And so you have the Old Testament. Everything in the Old Testament, New Testament, they're connected. Everything in the Old Testament is pointing to the New Testament. Everything after the Gospels and up to today is pointing backward to what Jesus did on the cross. Whenever you're doing almost anything from the Bible, it is so important to make that connection to Christ. It's there in every story. It's there in every story. Sometimes it's hard to find, and if you don't do it every time you teach a Bible story, that's okay? But you should at least be looking for it. Be looking for it. And I know there's a lot of very good curriculums that do that, where they'll do an Old Testament story, but here's the connecting point to Jesus. Here's the connecting point to Jesus. Maybe it's because it's about forgiveness and, or whatever it might be, or a sacrifice, Abraham sacrificing his son. But don't forget the focal point. And even if you aren't presenting it, look for it so it's in the back of your mind. Look for it so it's there for you too, okay? So, when we're talking about context, and when we're talking about it's all connected, and we're talking about making sure that people, that kids know where you're coming from with the story, and you're giving them, the Stan Lee principle, I recommend getting a good Harmony of the Gospels book, which means it's the Gospels, all 4 Gospels in order. That's the problem with the Bible for us today. Narratively speaking, we tell stories in a different way because we tell stories in a chronology from beginning to end. But biblical writers didn't do that. They were doing things more thematically, okay, just in broad strokes. And I haven't done a study on this. This is just me and my thought, but it's more thematically. If you're looking at the Gospels, they're going to have some stories that kind of go along together, but they maybe didn't happen together. But one of the things when I was researching the Christ, one of the things I did was I got a couple different harmonies of the Gospel, and what I found was I didn't realize, that story happened right after that story? What? Jesus walked on water, and then when they got to where they were going the next day, he cast demons out into pigs. That's connected. And so have that context. Even if you don't use it, it's going to be helpful for you to have that context and to be able to understand this is the order that things may have gone. The reason I say maybe get a couple, and there are a bunch of different ones online. When I did the Christ, I had a book that I had from college that I actually bought at a really, one of those cheap bookstores. It's not a used one, but it's all the remainder books and everything. But then there's also 2 different websites that I went to, and then I made note cards. And there were some times where I'm looking at the book, I'm looking at the website, and I'm thinking, I like this one better. And so I would do a little bit of research to see which one is, oh, no one knows? Okay, I'm going to go with this one. But a good harmony of the Gospels and a chronological Bible. A chronological Bible, which puts the Bible in order from Genesis to Revelation so that you can see where things happen, because there's things that are happening in one book and then there's also things happening at the same time in another book. Especially when you're getting into the exile. And that was another thing where I was researching a book called Kingdoms for Zondervan. It was another graphic novel series. And I'm researching this book and I'm finding out, these guys may have known each other. It was crazy to see that these things were happening at the same time. And again, this is for your own benefit, for reference for storytelling, and for reference for you when you're looking at your curriculum, so you can see, where does it happen? Where did it happen? But also for your own personal reading, just for your own personal knowledge. Next, the faster, more intense principle. George Lucas, when he was making the first Star Wars movie, the story goes that as he was giving his actors direction, he was telling them, faster, more intense, faster, more intense, faster, more intense. That was the direction he kept giving them. The reason is because emotion and motion both bring connection. And that's one of the reasons why I like talking with my hands, why I pace on the stage, is because motion gives connection. Motion gives connection. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to this point later on, but volume changes gives connection as well and draws people in, okay? And so the example I use is actually from Star Wars as well. When you have that opening crawl, it's and then in Empire Strikes Back and in Return of the Jedi both, you have this, all of a sudden it gets really quiet, and you have a giant ship going over. And it creates a moment of awe and wonder. And so when you're doing that, fluctuate your voice, go up, go down, talk quiet. Take time to have silence. Take time to have silence, because silence, sometimes kids are talking and then suddenly you stop and they're like, well, what's going on over there? And because suddenly they're connected there. Motion as well. One of the things, this is a storytelling thing that I do. You may do this as well, but if you don't, this is a great thing to do. When you're telling a story, you're talking about multiple people in the story, move your body. When you're talking about the paralyzed man, and then you're talking about Jesus, and the paralyzed man came, and move your body. So you're actually, it's almost like, and I call it the V formation, because that's what it's called on stage. It's the V formation, where you turn your body a little bit so you're facing out to the audience, and then you turn your body a little bit so it's like you're facing this other character. And you add a third character. And then you can also use that for geographic locations. When you start out and you're talking about Moses, and he's out taking care of the sheep, and then he sees the fiery bush. Move on the stage. But motion and emotion both bring connection. All right, the artist's life on film. George Lucas did it, but he's not the only one. George Lucas said you can't write a main character and not have him be a part of you. Here's the example. George Lucas, and Luke Skywalker, Luke S. Lucas, Luke S. Coincidence? I don't think so. There's no argument that George Lucas put himself into Star Wars. If you've ever seen American Graffiti, it's even more so. That is basically a fictional story about his life. But George Lucas drag raced. George Lucas grew up in a desert area. George Lucas grew up and lived on a walnut farm. Luke lived on a moisture farm, okay? And so you have all these little elements that George Lucas was putting in, and it happens to any fiction writer. You're going to have to use things that come from your life. But what does it mean for you? When you're doing these Bible stories and talking about these Bible stories with these kids, make it personal. Make it personal. Look for your own personal connecting point. Find a way to make it personal. Kids love the personal story. Sometimes when I'm setting up a story, setting up a lesson, I tell them a story from my childhood. They love stories about little Benji Avery, because in the time I fell off of a roof, or the time that I don't tell this one too much, but the time when I had to put my dog down. They love the stories of you as a child because it's a connecting point that they have. Again, we're going back to story. They can see and say, they were little too? They were little, oh. And they can see that you know them. You understand them. Make it personal. Make the story personal for you. Make it personal for them. Find your connecting point to the story. Another thing, if you are looking at a story that you've taught every year for all of your life, I was born on a Wednesday. I was in church on a Sunday. What does that mean? That means I've heard the Christmas story at least 48 times, but more, all right? And so every time I tell that story, I have to find something either new to learn or something old that needs to be remembered. And so I think that's what I'm going to have to leave you with here is that. But yeah. So you're welcome. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
So let's get into the 2 points I wasn't able to get into at the conference. And again, these have a broad application. I was really disappointed that I wasn't able to get to this in my actual session because I really wanted this to be an encouragement to the people who were in the room. But it's also hopefully has much broader application and a much broader encouragement to you. The principle is called the Monty Python principle. And it comes from the fact that the Monty Python's Flying Circus was produced by the BBC. And the BBC was putting money into it. The BBC was putting it out on the airwaves, which meant the BBC had a big say in what went into the show. The BBC had their standards and practices, and they had their budget. And so Monty Python, the group, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, all those guys, they had to abide by that, which meant they had to get super creative. When they went and did Monty Python's Holy Grail, they kept that same attitude. They kept that same mindset. Now, budget was a big part of that, but they created a movie that kind of used the same paradigm that they were using when they were creating Flying Circus. But then later on, as they're getting into making these movies, they realized they didn't have standards and practices breathing down their neck. They realized they didn't have the same kind of budgetary constraints, and so they could do whatever they wanted. And they did whatever they wanted. And if you ask me, and if you ask my roommate in college, who was the first one who told me about this principle, now he didn't call it the Monty Python principle, but he did have this theory about Monty Python. And that was that the later stuff that they did wasn't as funny because they didn't have as much creative constraints. So the Monty Python principle, I hope, is an encouragement to anyone and everyone who is out there making content, who is out there doing stuff and trying to figure out, how do I tell this story? How do I get this done? And the way that this works is, don't let your limitations and boundaries hold you back. Don't let your limitations and boundaries hold you back. Instead, let them encourage your creativity and let them push you forward. Now, maybe you have to fit in this small box, but as you're looking and examining this small box, figure out what fits in this box. Pack it tight, if you're going to take the metaphor to the extreme here. But when you have boundaries, it creates a forced creativity where you have to work around things and you have to figure out things. And in a lot of ways, it really can it really can allow you to produce something that you would have never produced before because you didn't have those boundaries. So I want to encourage you, whether you're in a small church with a small budget, or whether you're in a big church with a lot of expectations, or whether, you're trying to produce some sort of book or novel or graphic novel or whatever it is that you're working on, take a look, take stock of the boundaries that you have in your way and get creative and let those boundaries push your creativity. So that was one of the and more. This is the Gold 5 principle. This is in the title. This is Star Wars. Now, the Gold 5 principle comes from the orders to stay on target that come from Gold 5 as they are doing the trench run in the first Star Wars movie. And he's saying, stay on target. I can't do it. Stay on target. This dude goes, stay on target. Listen up. Stay on target. Ah! And the guy dies. Okay, so we're going to ignore the part about the guy dying in the trench because he was being told to stay on target. The whole stay on target thing, though, is something that I think is very, very helpful to just keep your focus. Keep your focus on the important thing. Keeping the main thing, as I've heard some people say. I used to use this with my son when he was Bible quizzing, and he'd be sitting on the bench and he'd be getting distracted, and I'd be, I was coaching the quizzing team, and I was like, hey, stay on target. And he'd turn his eyes and he would look at the quizmaster. The targets that we want to stay on were written with storytelling in the context of a classroom, especially. But this is also something you can take as far as just a broader application. The targets I'm talking about, first is the takeaways. What you want people to walk away from your story remembering and learning. And so you want to make sure that everything in your storytelling is pointing to the takeaway, is pushing toward it. Now, in a Sunday school classroom, that means, finding games that push toward the takeaway. That means maybe choosing worship songs based on the takeaway. That means, creating your small group activities based on the takeaway, but letting everything support your takeaways. The other thing you want to remember as a target is the story itself, and that is being true to the story. The reason I got the job doing George R. R. Martin's The Hedge Knight was because my script sample was true to his writing, and he really appreciated that. I knew when this book went out, it wasn't going to say Ben Avery's The Hedge Knight. It was going to say George R. R. Martin's The Hedge Knight. And so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't taking away anything, and I'm adapting it from his novel into a comic book form. And so I want to make sure it was presenting his story. Now, there are some little Ben moments in there that, if you know me, there's some little pieces that I put in as background information that got through. And so there are some bits of me in there as I'm telling the story. And you can do that. Put yourself into the story as you're telling the story, but stay on target with what your story is and honor the truth of the story. Honor the truth of the story. I did a comic for Voice of the Martyrs. It was a true story about a family that was facing deadly persecution. And I read their story. It was in a chapter in a book, and it was an article from a magazine. That's what they sent me. That's what I was supposed to use to be able to tell the story. And I did everything I could to find out. This goes back to the context and understanding context and presenting context. I had an artist friend in Indonesia, and I was able to get information from him about what their house would have looked like and what what would have been hanging on their walls in their house. And the other thing I did was they sent me the copy of the magazine article that actually had a photo of the family. And I took that photo of the family, I cut it out, and I taped it on my desk. So every day that I was working on it, I could look at it and remember I was talking about a real family who really lived. And I was not embellishing the story. I was presenting their story. And that's true whether you're doing a nonfiction story. That's true whether you're doing, talking about a story from the Bible where you're talking about it with the kids. But stay on target with the story. Don't put too much into it that's extra, which we already talked about. But also stay on target with the story and don't let yourself go on too many rabbit trails, okay? Stay on target. Don't go on too many rabbit trails. The principle for staying on target and not going on too many rabbit trails is this. Sometimes rabbit trails just lead to rabbit poop, okay? It's the truth. Now, sometimes it gets a little laugh, sometimes it means you can go on over here and talk about, well, my dog did this, da 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 da. But you really want to stay on target. Don't go too far off track because you want to keep it tight. You want to make sure that people understand what you're trying to present, what you're trying to say, what you're trying to do. And so you want to stay on target with that. Now, these two things are kind of, in some ways, if you're talking about like writing fiction, they kind of go against each other, because I know that there's a school of thought that says your story should never start with the lesson. You always start with the characters in the story and then let the themes develop themselves. Or there's that school of thought that says if you are writing and you are a Christian, you need to make sure that you start knowing what your theme is and that you're going to... And I fall in between. I've done both. I do both. And I don't think either one of them is wrong. But you need to stay on target. If you're starting with your theme, if you're starting with your takeaway, stay on target with that. And talking about specifically fiction writing, if you're starting with just the story, stay on target with that. And then be true to the story. But that's the main thing, is be true to the targets. And the final target that you need to stay on target with the Christ. You stay on target with the takeaways, the story, and the Christ especially. This goes back to that idea of how the Old Testament is all pointing to the Christ, and everything in the New Testament after Jesus is pointing back to him, and everything in history after Jesus is pointing back to him. It's so much so that we base our calendar on this. We're 2023 years since the Christ. He's our focal point. And even if you are writing a book that has nothing to do with the sacrifice of Jesus or whatever, and doesn't have the Romans road in it, and it doesn't talk about John 3:16, you need to still keep that in mind and keep your eyes on him. Your heart and your pen will follow, and see where he leads you. Again, I've done many, many different stories, many, many different things over the years, and sometimes it blatantly presents information about Jesus, like my comic book, The Christ, which is now available at benavery.com. You can get the 12-issue miniseries or get the graphic novel collection. Little plug there. But I'm talking about my comic book, The Christ. That is clearly staying on target. Talk about the Christ. I've also done my science fiction novel, which has very, very little to do with spirituality, although it does have some characters that talk some theology in pop theology terms. But yeah. Anyway, stay on target with the takeaways, stay on target with the story, and stay on target with the Christ. As a Christian creator, as a Christian storyteller, as a Christian who is just presenting your view of the world, you have to remember to keep your eyes on him, because that's going to affect how you present your view of the world. So those are the two extra ones. I did make these last two ones a little bit more broad, and they're not as tightly focused in on storytelling for children in a church context. So thank you for spending time with me as I get to geek out about storytelling and get to geek out about talking about Jesus and get to geek out about all this stuff. And if you like what you heard, definitely please hit subscribe, hit like, and follow along. We've got lots of other videos that get into stuff a lot like this. And then, of course, there is the podcast as well at strangersandaliens.com, where we have over 400 episodes of content, lots and lots of different things. We are kind of readjusting how we present things and how I get guest hosts. I'm trying to get more guest hosts on the podcast who are writers and who have content that they're creating. I'm also working on getting a more regular schedule with Evan, but then also bringing in Steve a little bit more as he's spending more time with his family, just trying to work out, schedule things with that. And then also just working on getting guest hosts who aren't a part of the Strangers and Aliens family yet. So that's strangersandaliens.com. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/strangersandaliens, where you'll find memes and little thought pieces, and then also links and stuff when new episodes appear. So until next time, no matter who you are, no matter why you're here, Godspeed.